close your eyes, and let yourself drift back through centuries, through millennia, to a land of warm stone and shimmering sea. A peninsula reaching down into the blue waters of the Mediterranean, where mountains tumble into olive groves, and olive groves give way to the coast. This is ancient Greece, and there is so much to discover here. Fact 1. We begin, as all things must, with the land itself. Ancient Greece was not one unified country in the way we might imagine it today. It was instead a collection of hundreds of independent city-states, each with its own laws, its own customs, its own pride. These city-states were called polis, and at the height of Greek civilization, there were over 1,000 of them scattered across the mainland, the islands, and the coastlines of Asia Minor. The mountains that carved up the Greek landscape made it almost impossible for people to easily move between regions, and so these small, self-contained communities grew strong and distinct from one another, like pearls strung along a necklace of rock and sea. Fact 2. The city-state of Athens is perhaps the most famous of them all. But what many people don't know is that Athens is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, with evidence of human settlement on the Acropolis, that famous rocky hill at its heart, dating back at least 5,000 years. Long before the golden temples we imagine, there were people living on that hill, looking out over the same Aegean horizon, breathing the same dry, herb-scented air. Fact 3. Athens drew its name from Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. According to legend, Athena and the god Poseidon once competed for the honor of becoming the city's patron deity. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident and caused a saltwater spring to burst forth from the rock, a dramatic and powerful gift. But Athena offered something quieter. She caused an olive tree to grow. The people chose Athena's gift. The olive tree, they understood, would give them food, oil, timber, and trade. Wisdom, it seemed, had always been Athens' greatest treasure. Let that thought settle for a moment. The hush of a hillside. The silver shimmer of olive leaves in the breeze. Fact 4. The olive tree was, in many ways, the lifeblood of ancient Greek civilization. Olive oil was used for cooking, for lighting oil lamps, for cleaning the body after exercise, for religious ceremonies, and as a prized trade commodity shipped across the Mediterranean world. An athlete who won at the ancient Olympics was crowned not with gold, but with a simple wreath of wild olive leaves, a symbol worth more, in that world, than any medal. Fact 5. And speaking of the Olympics, the ancient games were first recorded in 776 BCE, held in the sanctuary of Olympia in the western Peloponnese. They took place every 4 years, a cycle the Greeks called an Olympiad, and this cycle was so important that the Greeks actually used it as a way of measuring time itself. Rather than counting years from a single fixed point, they would say something happened in the 3rd year of the 14th Olympiad. The games gave the ancient world its calendar. The sanctuary at Olympia was a peaceful, tree-lined place, filled with temples, altars, and the quiet sound of the Alpheus River moving slowly past. Fact 6. During the period of the Olympic Games, something extraordinary happened. A sacred truce, called the Kyria, was declared across the Greek world. Wars were paused. Armies stood down. Athletes and spectators were granted safe passage through hostile territories to reach Olympia. For those few weeks, the fighting stopped. The entire Greek world, fragmented and quarrelsome as it usually was, held its breath together and watched young men run. It is a remarkable thing to consider that sport, for a time, held more sway than war. Fact 7. The ancient Olympics included events that would feel familiar to us today: running, wrestling, javelin, discus. But they also included the pankration, a brutal full-contact sport that combined wrestling and boxing with almost no rules, and the pentathlon, a 5-event contest testing a man's all-round athletic ability. Chariot racing was among the most prestigious events of all, and interestingly, it was the owner of the winning chariot, not the driver, who was awarded the victory crown. Wealthy aristocrats, and even queens, could claim Olympic glory without ever setting foot on the track. Fact 8. Women were, for the most part, forbidden from attending the Olympic Games at Olympia, at least during the classical period. However, there was a separate festival held in honor of the goddess Hera, called the Heraia, which featured foot races for unmarried women. It was held at the same stadium at Olympia, just as the male games were, and the victors received a crown of olive and, like their male counterparts, were celebrated as athletes of genuine honor. The wind through the valley at Olympia would have carried the cheers of those women, just as it carried every other victory cry across those ancient hills. Fact 9. Greece was also a land shaped profoundly by the sea. No part of the Greek mainland is more than about 80 miles from a coast. The sea was not just a backdrop to Greek life, it was its engine. Greeks sailed to trade, to colonize, to fish, to fight. They established colonies as far west as modern-day Spain and as far east as the shores of the Black Sea. By the classical period, Greek settlements dotted the entire Mediterranean coastline, spreading language, ideas, and culture across the known world like seeds scattered on the water. The sea carries us gently forward now, rocking us into the next chapter of this ancient world. Close your eyes a little more. Let the weight of the day grow distant. We are still here, in Greece, and there's so much more to discover. Fact 10. The ancient Greeks believed the world was watched over by 12 great gods, who lived atop Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in Greece, rising nearly 3,000 meters above sea level in the north of the country. These 12, known as the Olympians, included Zeus, the king of the gods, Hera, his wife and queen, Poseidon, lord of the seas, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, Athena, goddess of wisdom, Apollo, god of the sun and music, Artemis, goddess of the hunt, Oz, god of war, Aphrodite, goddess of love, Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, Hermes, the messenger, and Dionysus, god of wine and theater. 12 thrones on a mountain, wreathed in cloud, each occupied by a personality as vivid and flawed and human as the people who worship them. Fact 11. What made the Greek gods so unusual, compared to the divine figures of many other ancient religions, was how thoroughly human they were. They fell in love. They grew jealous. They played tricks, held grudges, showed favoritism, made mistakes, and sometimes behaved with breathtaking pettiness. Zeus was endlessly unfaithful. Hera was endlessly vengeful. Poseidon sulked when he didn't get his way. The Greeks did not worship distant, unknowable forces. They worshipped personalities, rich and complicated and recognizable, because they believed the gods were simply more powerful versions of themselves. Fact 12. The god Apollo was one of the most widely revered across the Greek world. Among his many roles, he was the god of prophecy, and his most famous oracle was at Delphi, a sanctuary perched dramatically on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. People came from every corner of the Mediterranean world to consult the oracle of Delphi, known as the Pythia, a priestess who would enter a trance-like state and deliver cryptic pronouncements believed to be the words of Apollo himself. Kings consulted her before going to war. Colonists asked her where to settle. Ordinary people came with ordinary fears. For centuries, Delphi was the closest thing the ancient world had to a universal source of divine guidance. Imagine the long road up through the mountains, the smell of incense, the hushed reverence of the waiting crowds. A question carried all that way, pressed close to the heart. Fact 13. The sanctuary at Delphi also bore a famous inscription above its entrance. 3 simple words in ancient Greek, know thyself. Know thyself. It is one of the most enduring philosophical phrases in all of human history, and it greeted every person who arrived seeking answers from the gods. Before you ask your question, the stone seemed to say, be honest about who you are asking it. Fact 14. Greek mythology was not simply a collection of entertaining stories, though it was certainly that too. It functioned as a framework for understanding the natural world. The Greeks explained the changing of the seasons through the myth of Persephone, daughter of Demeter, who was taken to the underworld by Hades and forced to spend part of each year beneath the earth. When Persephone descended, Demeter grieved and the crops withered, and so came winter. When Persephone returned, the earth bloomed again. In this way, a story about a mother's love and loss became the explanation for why the world goes cold and then warm again, year after year, without end. Fact 15. The ancient Greeks had a profound and complex relationship with death. They believed that when a person died, their soul, called the psyche, traveled to the underworld, a realm ruled by Hades and his queen Persephone. To reach it, the soul had to cross the river Styx, ferried by a boatman named Charon. Crucially, Charon required payment, a coin, traditionally placed on the eyes or in the mouth of the deceased. This is why archaeologists have found coins in the mouths of ancient Greek burials. The living were making sure the dead could afford their passage. It was an act of love and practicality, woven together in a single small coin. Fact 16. Not all the dead ended up in the same place in the Greek underworld. Those who had lived virtuous and heroic lives were sent to the Elysian fields, a paradise of endless meadows and soft golden light, where the blessed spent eternity in perfect peace. Ordinary souls went to the asphodel meadows, a neutral, gray, unremarkable existence, neither reward nor punishment. And those who had sinned greatly were condemned to Tartarus, a place of eternal suffering, as deep below the underworld as the underworld was below the earth. 3 destinations. 3 different kinds of silence at the end of a life. Fact 17. One of the most beloved figures in all of Greek mythology was Heracles, known to us more commonly by his Roman name, Hercules. He was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene, which made him a demigod, part divine, part human. His extraordinary strength was matched by an equally extraordinary capacity for suffering. The famous 12 labors of Heracles were imposed upon him as a form of penance, tasks so dangerous and seemingly impossible that they were designed to destroy him. He completed every one. The Greeks adored Heracles not because he was perfect, but because he kept going. Fact 18. The night sky held deep meaning for the ancient Greeks, and many of the constellations we still recognize today carry the names and shapes the Greeks gave them. Orion the hunter, Cassiopeia the queen, Perseus the hero, Andromeda the princess. These are Greek stories written in stars, stories that have been looked up at for thousands of years and are still up there now, unchanged, on any clear night. The same constellations that ancient Greek sailors used to navigate the Mediterranean are visible from your window tonight, if you care to look. But you don't have to look. You can simply know they are there, patient and permanent, keeping watch overhead. We drift on, carried gently through time. The stars are still above us, those old familiar constellations, and below them the city is beginning to wake. The soft gray of early morning settling over stone streets, the smell of bread baking, the distant sound of the sea. We are in the city now. Let us walk through it slowly. Fact 19. The ancient Greek city was built around a central public space called the agora. The word means, simply, gathering place, and that is exactly what it was, the beating heart of civic life. The agora was where merchants set up their stalls and traded goods, where politicians debated the affairs of the city, where philosophers paced and argued, where friends met and gossip spread and justice was sometimes dispensed. It was marketplace, town square, courthouse, and social club all rolled into one open, sunlit space. To be a citizen of an ancient Greek city was, in large part, to be a person of the agora. Fact 20. Athens gave the world one of its most enduring gifts, democracy. The word itself is Greek, formed from demos, meaning the people, and kratos, meaning power or rule. People power. The Athenian statesman Cleisthenes is credited with establishing the foundations of democratic governance in Athens around 508 BCE, introducing reforms that allowed ordinary male citizens to participate in the decisions of the city. It was an idea so radical that it had barely existed anywhere in the world before, and so durable that it still shapes how billions of people are governed today. Fact 21. Athenian democracy, however, was not democracy as we would recognize it. It was a direct democracy, meaning citizens did not elect representatives to vote on their behalf, as we do today. Instead, citizens gathered in person on a hillside called the PNYX, overlooking the city, and voted directly on laws and policies themselves. Every eligible citizen had an equal voice in that assembly. At its peak, the assembly might be attended by several thousand people, all gathered on that open hill, the whole city spread out below them, voting with their hands raised in the afternoon light. Fact 22. But that word eligible carried enormous weight. Athenian democracy excluded the vast majority of the people who actually lived in Athens. Women could not vote. Slaves, who made up perhaps a third of the population, had no political rights whatsoever. Foreign residents, known as metics, however long they had lived in the city, could not participate. Athenian democracy was a remarkable invention, genuinely revolutionary for its time, and also a deeply restricted one. The democracy belonged to free, native-born adult men, and to no one else. Let that paradox rest quietly for a moment, the world's first democracy, and all the people it left out. Fact 23. To prevent any single individual from gaining too much power and becoming a tyrant, Athens developed an extraordinary democratic tool called ostracism. Once a year, citizens could vote to exile a person they considered a danger to the city. Each voter scratched the name of their candidate onto a pottery shard, called an ostracon, from which we get the word ostracize, and if any individual received 6,000 or more votes against them, they were banished from Athens for 10 years. No charges, no trial, no appeal. The city simply decided it was better off without you for a while, and away you went. Archaeologists have found thousands of these pottery shards, names scratched into clay in ancient hands, a jar full of democratic anxieties. Fact 24. One of the most famous victims of Athenian democratic sentiment was not ostracized but put on trial and condemned to death. Socrates, the philosopher who wandered the agora asking uncomfortable questions of anyone who would engage with him, was tried in 399 BCE on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. He was found guilty by a jury of 500 citizens and sentenced to die by drinking a cup of hemlock poison. Socrates accepted the verdict with extraordinary calm, reasoning that a good man had nothing to fear from death. He spent his final hours in conversation with his friends, and then he drank the hemlock, and the greatest question asker of the ancient world fell silent. Fact 25. Socrates himself never wrote a single word. Everything we know about him comes from the writings of his students, most importantly a man named Plato. Plato recorded the conversations of Socrates in a series of texts called the Dialogues, in which Socrates leads various people through careful, probing discussions about justice, beauty, knowledge, virtue, and the nature of the soul. These texts are among the oldest works of philosophy in the Western tradition, and they are still read, still argued about, still taught in universities across the world, more than 2,400 years after they were written. Fact 26. Plato, inspired by the death of his teacher, went on to found a school of philosophy in Athens called the Academy, named after the park in which it was located, the grove of the hero Academos. The Academy became one of the most influential intellectual institutions in the ancient world, operating for nearly 900 years before it was finally closed. And from the Academy, the word academic has come down to us, used still today whenever we speak of scholarship, of study, of the quiet and serious pursuit of knowledge. Fact 27. One of the most brilliant students to attend Plato's Academy was a young man from northern Greece named Aristotle, who arrived at the age of 17 and stayed for 20 years. Aristotle would go on to become perhaps the most wide-ranging intellect in all of human history, writing authoritatively on logic, biology, physics, astronomy, politics, poetry, ethics, theater, and the nature of the soul. He studied animals with the careful attention of a naturalist, dissecting them and classifying them in ways that would not be improved upon for nearly 2,000 years. If Plato asked what things mean, Aristotle asked how things work. The two men, teacher and student, have between them shaped the course of Western thought more than almost any other pair of human beings who ever lived. The light shifts now. We move away from the agora, away from the philosophers and their gentle arguments, and we travel south and west across the Peloponnese, through mountain passes and dry river valleys, to a city that was built not on words, but on silence, on discipline, on iron. We are going to Sparta. Come quietly. Fact 28. Sparta was, in almost every way, the opposite of Athens. Where Athens valued art, philosophy, commerce, and debate, Sparta valued one thing above all others: military excellence. The entire structure of Spartan society was organized around the production of the perfect soldier. From the moment a Spartan citizen was born, their life was shaped by the demands of war. The state was not a backdrop to Spartan life. The state was Spartan life, completely and without remainder. Fact 29. When a Spartan baby was born, it was brought before a council of elders who examined it carefully. If the child appeared weak, sickly, or deformed, it was taken to a place called the Apothete, a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetos, and left to die. Only strong children were permitted to survive and grow into Spartan citizens. It was a brutal practice, and the Greeks themselves were not entirely comfortable with it. But to the Spartans, it was simply practicality. The city could not afford weakness. Fact 30. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and entered into a state-run education and training system called the agoge. The word means roughly upbringing or training, and it lasted until a young man was 30 years old. During this time, boys lived in communal barracks, slept on beds of reeds they had to cut themselves, were deliberately underfed to encourage resourcefulness, and were subjected to physical hardship as a matter of daily routine. They were taught to endure pain without complaint. Crying was considered a profound disgrace. The nights in those barracks must have been very long and very quiet. Fact 31. Spartan warriors were trained to be the finest soldiers in the ancient world, and by most accounts they succeeded. The Spartan phalanx, a tight formation of soldiers standing shield to shield, spears leveled, was the most feared military unit in Greece for centuries. Spartan soldiers did not fight for glory or personal honor in the way warriors of other cultures often did. They fought for the man beside them. The formation held, or it did not, and the formation was everything. Individual brilliance was less important than collective discipline, and that discipline was forged over 20 years of relentless, grinding training. Fact 32. Spartan women occupied a remarkably different position in society compared to their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. While Athenian women were largely confined to the home and excluded from public life, Spartan women exercised freely, received an education, managed family estates while their husbands were away at war, and were permitted to own property. They were expected to be strong because they were expected to produce strong children. A famous Spartan saying held that only Spartan women gave birth to real men, a line that tells you a great deal about how Spartan women thought of themselves. Fact 33. The word laconic, meaning brief, spare, and economical with words, comes from Laconia, the region of Greece in which Sparta was located. The Spartans were famous across the ancient world for saying very little and meaning every word. When the Persian king Xerxes sent a message to the Spartan king Leonidas demanding that the Spartans surrender their weapons, Leonidas is said to have replied with just 2 words in Greek, molon lab, come and take them. It remains one of the most celebrated acts of verbal defiance in history, compressed into the smallest possible space, which is exactly how the Spartans preferred it. Fact 34. The Battle of Thermopylae, fought in 480 BCE, is among the most famous last stands in all of military history. A Persian army of several 100,000 men, led by King Xerxes, was held at a narrow coastal pass by a Greek force that included 300 Spartan warriors under King Leonidas. For 3 days, the small Greek force held the pass, using the narrow terrain to negate the Persians' overwhelming numerical advantage. They were eventually betrayed by a local man who showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass. Leonidas, knowing the battle was lost, sent most of the Greek allies away and remained with his 300 Spartans and a small number of others to fight to the last man. None of them came home. Fact 35. At the site of Thermopylae, a stone monument was erected in honor of the fallen Spartans. The epitaph inscribed on it, written by the poet Simonides, is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing from the ancient world. It reads, in translation, "Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, will I. No boasting, no lamentation, only the fact of what they did, and why. Obedient to their laws." It was, for Spartan, the highest possible praise. Fact 36. Despite their rivalry and their profound differences, Athens and Sparta were sometimes forced to fight side by side. The Persian Wars of the early 5th century BCE, of which Thermopylae was a part, brought many of the Greek city-states into an uneasy alliance against a common enemy. At the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, an Athenian force famously defeated a Persian army on the coastal plain northeast of Athens. The victory was so unexpected, so extraordinary, that a messenger named Pheidippides is said to have run the entire distance from the battlefield to Athens, roughly 26 miles, to deliver the news, gasped the single word Nike, meaning victory, and then collapsed and died. 2,500 years later, we still run that distance in his honor. We call it a marathon. We leave the mountains behind now, and the sound of the wind in the passes fades. We are moving back toward the coast, back toward the warmth and the light, and something is drifting toward us on the air, music, perhaps, or laughter, or the low murmur of a great crowd settling into their seats. We are heading toward the theater. Find your place. The performance is about to begin. Fact 37. Theater as we know it, plays performed on a stage before a seated audience, was invented by the ancient Greeks. It grew out of religious festivals held in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation, and the earliest theatrical performances were essentially elaborate choral hymns sung and danced in his honor. Over time, individual actors were added, then dialogue, then plot, then conflict, and from those simple ceremonial beginnings the entire tradition of Western drama was born. Every play ever written, every film ever made, every story ever told on a stage traces its ancestry back to those Greek hillsides and the god of the vine. Fact 38. Greek theaters were architectural masterpieces of acoustic engineering. Built into natural hillsides in a semicircular shape, with tiered stone seating rising steeply above a circular performance area called the orchestra, they were designed to carry the human voice with extraordinary clarity to every seat in the house. The theater of Epidaurus, one of the best preserved in the world, could seat 14,000 people, and even today a coin dropped at its center can be heard clearly from the very back row. The Greeks built these theaters without microphones, without amplification, without any technology beyond stone and mathematics, and a profound understanding of how sound travels. Fact 39. Ancient Greek drama was divided into two great forms, tragedy and comedy. Tragedy explored the fall of great men and women, the conflict between human desire and divine will, the terrible consequences of pride and blindness and fate. Comedy, by contrast, was raucous, irreverent, and often extremely coarse, full of political satire, physical humor, and jokes that would not be out of place in a modern stand-up routine. The Greeks understood instinctively that human life contains both registers, the devastating and the ridiculous, sometimes in the very same moment, and they built both into the foundations of their theatrical tradition. Fact 40. The three great tragedians of ancient Athens, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, produced work of such power and depth that it has never stopped being performed. Sophocles alone wrote over 120 plays, of which only 7 survive, and among those 7 is Oedipus Rex, the story of a king who unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother, then blinds himself when he discovers the truth. Sigmund Freud, 2,500 years later, would use that story as the basis for one of the central concepts of psychoanalysis. The ancient Greeks had already mapped the territory of the human unconscious, long before anyone had a name for it. Fact 41. Greek actors wore large, expressive masks during performances, covering the entire face, with exaggerated features designed to be visible from the back rows of enormous open-air theaters. The masks also served a practical purpose. Since all performers were male, masks allowed men to convincingly play female characters by simply changing what they wore on their face. Each mask communicated a character type instantly: the grieving queen, the tyrannical king, the comic fool. Those two famous masks, one smiling and one weeping, that have become the universal symbol of theater to this day, are direct descendants of the masks worn on Greek stages 2,500 years ago. Fact 42. Beyond the theater, the ancient Greeks produced some of the most celebrated sculpture in human history. Greek sculptors of the classical period were obsessed with the human body, its proportions, its musculature, its potential for expressing emotion and dignity and power. They developed a principle called contrapposto, in which a standing figure shifts its weight onto one leg, causing a subtle, natural twist through the hips and shoulders, giving the statue the appearance of life, of movement, of a body caught in a quiet moment between one step and the next. It was a revolution in how stone could be made to breathe. Fact 43. One of the most famous sculptures of the ancient world was a colossal statue of Zeus at Olympia, considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Created by the sculptor Phades around 435 BCE, it sat inside the temple of Zeus and depicted the god seated on a great throne, so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling of the temple. Ancient writers recorded that visitors who entered the temple were overcome with awe, that the sheer presence of the figure seemed to fill the space with something beyond the merely human. The statue no longer exists, but the descriptions of those who stood before it and felt the breath go out of them have survived. Our fact 44. The Parthenon, the great temple to Athena that still crowns the Acropolis of Athens, was built between 447 and 432 BCE under the direction of the statesman Pericles, and is considered the finest example of ancient Greek architecture ever constructed. What is less widely known is that the Parthenon contains almost no perfectly straight lines. Its columns are very slightly wider in the middle than at the top and bottom, a technique called entasis, and the entire floor of the temple curves very subtly upward toward the center. These refinements were deliberate, designed to counteract the optical illusions that make truly straight lines appear to sag or taper when viewed from a distance. The Parthenon looks perfect because it is, in fact, very carefully imperfect. Fact 45. Greek pottery, often overlooked beside the glamour of sculpture and architecture, is one of our richest sources of knowledge about daily life in the ancient world. Painted with extraordinary skill and detail, Greek pots and vases depict athletic competitions, religious ceremonies, wedding processions, battles, mythological scenes, drinking parties, and the quiet routines of domestic life, women weaving, children playing, men in conversation. Because ceramic survives almost indefinitely underground, these images have outlasted almost everything else from that world. The painted surface of a pot has carried the faces of ordinary ancient Greeks across 2,500 years and set them down, still vivid, in our museums. Burning in a doorway, and the sound of voices, quiet, unhurried, thinking out loud, drifts toward us through the warm dark. We are being invited in. Come and sit down. There is wine, and there is conversation, and there is no particular hurry. Fact 46. The ancient Greeks had a tradition called the symposium, a word that means, literally, drinking together. A symposium was a formal gathering of men, held in a room called the andron, or men's quarters, in which guests reclined on couches arranged around the walls, drank wine diluted with water, and engaged in conversation, debate, poetry, music, and philosophical discussion. The wine was always mixed. Drinking it undiluted was considered a sign of barbarism, and the evening was governed by a host who set the tone, chose the topics, and decided how strong to make the mixture. Some symposia were elegant and intellectual. Others, as the night wore on, became considerably less so. Fact 47. Plato wrote one of his most celebrated works, simply titled The Symposium, as a recreation of one such evening, a dinner party at which each guest in turn delivers a speech in praise of love. The dialogue culminates in a speech by Socrates, who recounts the teachings of a wise woman named Diotima, describing love not merely as physical desire but as a yearning of the soul toward the eternal, the beautiful, and the good. It is one of the most profound and haunting explorations of love ever written, and it began, as so many great things in ancient Greece began, with people lying on couches, drinking wine, and refusing to stop thinking. Fact 48. The ancient Greeks were among the first people in the world to ask systematic questions about the nature of the physical universe, not through myth or religion, but through observation and reason. A philosopher named Thales of Miletus, living in the 6th century BCE, proposed that the fundamental substance of all matter was water, that everything in the universe was, at its deepest level, a form of water. He was wrong, of course, but the question he was asking was the right one, and the method he used, rational inquiry rather than divine explanation, was entirely new. Thales is often called the first philosopher and also the first scientist, which are perhaps the same thing at their roots. Fact 49. A philosopher named Democritus, living in the 5th century BCE, proposed something that sounds remarkably modern. He suggested that all matter was made up of tiny, invisible, indivisible particles, which he called atomos, meaning uncuttable. These atoms, he argued, move through empty space and combined in different ways to create everything that existed. He had no instruments, no experiments, no microscope. He arrived at the concept of the atom through pure reasoning, more than 2,000 years before modern physics confirmed it. The word we still use, atom, is his word, unchanged across 25 centuries. Fact 50. The ancient Greeks also made extraordinary advances in mathematics. Pythagoras, whose theorem about right-angled triangles is still taught to every schoolchild in the world, was not only a mathematician, but the founder of a quasi-religious philosophical community that believed the universe was fundamentally mathematical in nature, that numbers were not just tools for measuring the world, but the very essence of it. His followers, called Pythagoreans, were an almost cult-like group who observed strict dietary rules, kept their discovery secret, and believed that the planets produced musical harmony as they moved through the heavens, a concept they called the music of the spheres. Fact 51. Euclid, working in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, in a city founded by the Greek conqueror Alexander the Great, wrote a work called The Elements, which systematically laid out the foundations of geometry. It became one of the most widely read books in human history, used as the primary textbook for teaching mathematics for over 2,000 years. When Abraham Lincoln wanted to sharpen his powers of logical reasoning as a young man, he read Euclid. When mathematicians today speak of a clean, elegant proof, they reach instinctively for the word Euclid himself would have used. The straight line, the circle, the angle, these are his vocabulary, still. Fact 52. Archimedes of Syracuse, perhaps the greatest mathematician and engineer of the ancient world, famously discovered the principle of water displacement, the idea that an object submerged in water displaces a volume of water equal to its own volume, while lowering himself into a bath. The realization came on him so suddenly and completely that he leapt from the bath and ran through the streets naked, shouting, "Eureka! I have found it." Whether the story is literally true or not, the word has passed into every language on earth, and we still say it today in that same moment of sudden, joyful understanding. Fact 53. The philosopher Epicurus, who founded his school in a garden in Athens in the 4th century BCE, taught that the purpose of human life was a pursuit of happiness, but not the happiness of excess or indulgence. True happiness, Epicurus argued, came from simple pleasures, close friendships, freedom from fear, and the quiet contentment of a life lived without unnecessary ambition or anxiety. He and his students ate plain food, walked in the garden, talked about ideas, and tried, day by day, to want only what they already had. His philosophy has been misunderstood for centuries as an endorsement of luxury and pleasure-seeking. In fact, it was almost the opposite, a gentle, radical argument for simplicity and peace. The symposium is behind us now, the lamp finally extinguished, the last conversation dissolved into the dark. We step outside into the night air, and something has shifted. There is a new energy on the horizon, distant, enormous, moving fast. A young man is coming. He is riding hard, and the world is about to change in ways nobody quite expected. Listen. You can almost hear the hoofbeats. Our fact 54. Alexander the Great was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia in northern Greece. He was the son of King Philip II, one of the most formidably capable military and political minds of the ancient world. And from his earliest years it was clear that the boy was extraordinary, restless, brilliant, fiercely competitive, and possessed of an ambition so large it seemed to strain the boundaries of the world available to contain it. As a child, When he heard news of his father's latest military victories, Alexander is said to have wept, not from pride, but from fear that his father would conquer everything and leave nothing for him. Fact 55. Alexander's tutor from the age of 13 was none other than Aristotle, who was personally selected by King Philip to educate his son. For 3 years, in a quiet sanctuary called the Nymphaeum near the city of Mieza, Aristotle taught the young Alexander philosophy, medicine, science, rhetoric, and literature. Alexander developed a particular and lifelong passion for Homer's Iliad, the great epic poem about the Trojan War, and kept a copy of it, annotated by Aristotle himself, under his pillow alongside a dagger as he slept. He saw himself as a new Achilles, the Iliad's great hero, beautiful, doomed, and hungry for immortal glory. Fact 56. At the age of just 20, Alexander inherited the throne of Macedonia following his father's assassination. Within 2 years, he had subdued the rebellious Greek city-states and secured his home territory. Then he turned east. Over the next 11 years, Alexander led his army on one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in human history, crossing into Persia, sweeping through Egypt, pushing deep into Central Asia, crossing the Hindu Kush Mountains in winter, and finally reaching the banks of the Indus River in what is now Pakistan. He never lost a single battle. Not one, in 11 years of almost continuous warfare across 20,000 miles. Fact 57. In Egypt, which he conquered from the Persian Empire in 332 BCE, Alexander was welcomed not as an invader, but as a liberator, and was declared pharaoh by the Egyptians and son of the god Amun. He visited the great oracle at the Siwa oasis deep in the western desert, and what the oracle told him that he never revealed to anyone, not even his closest companions. He carried the secret of that desert sanctuary to his grave. We still do not know what was said to him in that quiet, sand-surrounded place, so far from everything he knew. Fact 58. Alexander founded over 20 cities during his campaigns, scattering them across his conquered territories like seeds, and named a remarkable number of them after himself. Alexandria in Egypt, now the second largest city in the modern Egyptian state, is the most famous, but there were Alexandrias in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and across Central Asia. He also named at least one city after his beloved horse, Bucephalus, who died during the Indian campaign. The city of Bucephala was founded on the banks of the Hydaspes River in his horse's honor. It is, as far as history records, the only major city ever named after a horse. Fact 59. Alexander's conquest spread Greek language, culture, art, and ideas across an enormous swath of the ancient world, from Egypt to the borders of India. This period of Greek cultural influence, which lasted from Alexander's conquests until the rise of Rome, is known as the Hellenistic Age. In this era, Greek became the common language of trade, diplomacy, and scholarship across the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. It was in this Hellenistic Greek, not the classical Greek of Athens, that the New Testament of the Christian Bible would later be written, meaning that Alexander's linguistic legacy shaped one of the most widely read texts in all of human history. Fact 60. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, aged just 32. The cause of his death remains disputed to this day. Proposed explanations range from typhoid fever complicated by other illness, to excessive drinking, to poisoning by his own generals. He had conquered more of the known world than anyone before him, and he died without a clear heir, without a plan for what would come after, without having arranged what his extraordinary empire would become once he was no longer there to hold it together by the sheer force of his personality. His generals immediately began fighting each other for the pieces. Fact 61. When Alexander lay dying, his companions gathered around him and asked to whom he left his empire. He is said to have replied, in a whisper, "Toi kratostoi," to the strongest. Some scholars believe he may actually have said a name that was misheard. Others think he was simply too far gone to say anything meaningful at all. Whatever the truth, his answer, to the strongest, became a kind of dark prophecy. The wars that followed his death, fought between his former generals, tore his empire apart over the next 40 years, and the world he had built with such ferocious energy quietly came undone. Fact 62. One of the most remarkable institutions to emerge from Alexander's conquests was a great library of Alexandria in Egypt, established in the early 3rd century BCE under the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty that inherited Egypt after Alexander's death. The library was the most ambitious attempt in the ancient world to gather all human knowledge in one place. At its height, it may have held 500,000 papyrus scrolls, works of science, philosophy, literature, mathematics, medicine, and history from across the known world. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were searched, and any books found on board were confiscated and copied, with a copy returned to the owner and the original kept for the library. Knowledge was gathered with a quiet, relentless hunger. The empire has settled now into a long, still quietness. The dust from all those armies has drifted down and come to rest. And in the calm that follows, we find ourselves looking not outward at conquests and kingdoms, but inward, at the body, at its workings, at the quiet miracle of simply being alive and breathing and here. We are moving now into the world of the everyday. The morning light on a courtyard wall, the smell of bread and olive oil, the ordinary hours of an ordinary life, lived 2,500 years ago, and not so very different, in the end, from ours. Fact 63. The ancient Greeks were the first people in the Western world to approach medicine as a rational discipline rather than a supernatural one. Before Greek medicine, illness was widely understood as divine punishment or demonic possession, and treatment was a matter for priests and prayers. It was a Greek physician from the island of Kos named Hippocrates, living in the 5th century BCE, who argued systematically that disease had natural causes, that the body was governed by physical processes that could be observed, understood, and treated through careful attention and reasoned intervention. He is called the father of medicine, and doctors across the world still take an oath in his name on the day they qualify. Fact 64. The Hippocratic Oath, taken by physicians today in various modern forms, originates in the tradition of Hippocratic medicine, though the exact text we associate with it was likely written by his followers rather than Hippocrates himself. Its core commitments: to do no harm, to treat patients with dignity, to maintain confidentiality, to use treatments only for the benefit of the sick, have proven so durable and so fundamental that they have survived largely intact for nearly 2,500 years. The oldest promise in professional life is a Greek one. Fact 65. Hippocrates and his followers believed that health was governed by 4 substances in the body, which they called the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these 4 were in balance, a person was healthy. When they fell out of balance, illness resulted. The theory was wrong, but it was a genuine attempt to find a systematic physical explanation for sickness and well-being, and it dominated Western medicine for nearly 2,000 years. Even today, the words we use to describe personality types, sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic, are direct descendants of the 4 humours, fossils of ancient Greek medicine embedded quietly in our everyday language. Fact 66. The ancient Greeks placed great importance on physical exercise and the care of the body. Every significant Greek city had a gymnasium, from the Greek word gymnos, meaning naked, because exercise was performed without clothing. The gymnasium was not merely a place to train the body, however. It was also a place of intellectual and social life, where philosophers taught, young men debated, and the cultivation of the mind was understood to be inseparable from the cultivation of the body. The Greeks had a word for the ideal they were reaching toward, kallikagathia, meaning the beautiful and the good together, physical and moral excellence as a single unified quality. Fact 67. The typical ancient Greek diet was simple, seasonal, and closely tied to the landscape. The 3 great staples were grain, olives, and grapes, the so-called Mediterranean triad that has sustained people in this region for thousands of years. Bread was eaten at almost every meal, olive oil was used for cooking and dressing food, and wine, always diluted with water, was the standard drink of daily life. Meat was relatively rare for ordinary people, reserved largely for religious festivals when animals were sacrificed and the flesh distributed among the worshippers. The gods received the bones and fat burned on the altar. The people received the rest. Fact 68. Ancient Greek homes were built around an open central courtyard, called an hall, which served as the heart of domestic life. Cooking, weaving, childcare, and much of the social activity of the household took place in and around this courtyard, open to the sky and the light. The rooms surrounding it, sleeping quarters, storage rooms, the andron for male guests, were often small and simply furnished. Greek domestic life was, in many ways, an outdoor life, conducted under the open sky, in the warmth and light that the Mediterranean climate generously provided for most of the year. The home was not so much a place to be enclosed in as a place to be rooted in. Fact 69. Children in ancient Greece played with toys that would be immediately recognizable to a child today: terracotta dolls with jointed limbs, miniature horses on wheels, rattles, hoops, spinning tops, and small clay animals. Archaeologists have found these objects in the graves of children, placed there by grieving parents to accompany them, and the sight of a 2,500-year-old toy, a little jointed doll, or a tiny clay horse, carries across all that time a feeling of absolute recognition. The things children love have not changed. The love that placed those objects in those graves has not changed either. Fact 70. Sleep itself held a sacred place in the ancient Greek imagination. The god of sleep was Hypnos, a gentle deity who lived in a cave in the underworld through which the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, flowed. Hypnos moved silently through the world each night, touching people with a branch dipped in the waters of the Lethe, bringing them the gift of forgetting, of rest, of the body's nightly return to something like peace. His twin brother was Thanatos, the god of death, and the Greeks understood the two to be deeply related. Sleep, they believed, was a small and merciful rehearsal for the larger letting go that comes at the end. Let Hypnos find you now. Let the waters of the Lethe do their quiet work. The house is quiet now, the courtyard still, the last ember cooling in the hearth. And in that stillness, something lifts. The mind, freed from the noise of the day, rises gently upward, past the rooftops, past the olive trees, past the dark ridgeline of the hills, and out into the enormous, patient dark above. We are going to look at the sky now. We are going to think about the earth beneath our feet, and the sea that surrounds it, and the stars that have been watching all of this, all of it, every word of it, from the very beginning. Come up here. The view is extraordinary. Fact 71. The ancient Greeks were among the first people to understand that the earth was not flat. As early as the 6th century BCE, the philosopher Pythagoras proposed that the earth was spherical, reasoning from the curved shadow it cast on the moon during lunar eclipses and from the way ships disappeared hull first over the horizon. By the time of Aristotle, the spherical earth was widely accepted among educated Greeks as established fact. This was not a discovery that was later lost and had to be rediscovered. The idea that people in the medieval period believed in a flat earth is largely a myth. They had inherited the Greek understanding, and they kept it. Fact 72. A Greek scholar named Eratosthenes, working in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, did something that still inspires quiet amazement. He calculated the circumference of the entire earth using nothing more than a stick, a shadow, and his knowledge of geometry. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice in the city of Sin, in southern Egypt, the sun shone directly into a deep well with no shadow at all, meaning the sun was directly overhead. On that same day in Alexandria, he measured the angle of a shadow cast by a vertical stick and found it was about 7 degrees. Knowing the distance between the two cities, he used the geometry of a sphere to calculate the full circumference of the earth. His answer was remarkably close to the value we measure today with satellites. He did this more than 2,000 years ago, with a stick. Fact 73. The ancient Greeks did not only contemplate the size of the earth, some of them contemplated its place in the universe. A Greek astronomer named Aristarchus of Samos, working in the 3rd century BCE, proposed something that would not be widely accepted for nearly 18 centuries, that the earth and the other planets moved around the sun, not the other way around. He was the first person in recorded history to propose a heliocentric model of the solar system. His idea was largely rejected in his own time. Most Greek thinkers preferred an earth-centered universe, and the world would have to wait for Copernicus, in the 16th century CE, to arrive at the same conclusion and have it finally taken seriously. Fact 74. Greek sailors navigated by the stars with extraordinary confidence and skill. The North Star, Polaris, served as a fixed point of reference or direction, and the positions of constellations throughout the year told sailors not only where they were but what time of year it was. The Pleiades, a small cluster of stars in the constellation Taurus, were used as an agricultural and maritime calendar. Their rising in spring signaled the season for sailing and planting, and their setting in autumn meant it was time to bring the ships ashore and prepare for winter. The sky was not merely beautiful to the ancient Greeks. It was a working document, consulted daily, trusted with lives. Fact 75. The ancient Greeks believed the world was surrounded by a great river called Oceanus, a vast, encircling stream that flowed around the edge of the known earth, beyond which lay mystery and darkness and the unknown. This was not merely a myth. It reflected a genuine geographical understanding of the world as an island of land surrounded entirely by water. When Greek sailors pushed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the open Atlantic, they were crossing into Oceanus itself, the edge of the world, and the courage required to do so should not be underestimated. Every sailor who passed those pillars was stepping into the unimaginable. Fact 76. The Greek philosopher Anaximander, one of the earliest thinkers of the Milesian school, created what may be the first known map of the world, in the 6th century BCE. It depicted the known world as a flat disk surrounded by the great ocean, with Greece at its center, as maps have always tended to place their makers at the center of everything. More remarkably, Anaximander also proposed that life on Earth had originally emerged from the sea, and that human beings had evolved from simpler creatures. He reasoned that human infants, unlike the young of other animals, are helpless for so long after birth that they could not have survived without some earlier, simpler form of existence to develop from. It was a proto-evolutionary idea, arrived at through pure reasoning 24 centuries before Darwin. Fact 77. The ancient Greeks had a profound relationship with the sea that was equal parts love and terror. Poseidon, god of the sea, was also the god of earthquakes, called the Earth Shaker, and his temperament was understood to be as unpredictable and violent as the water he ruled. Greek sailors made offerings and prayers before every voyage, and the sea itself was spoken of with careful respect, never boasted about, never taken for granted. The Aegean in particular, dotted with islands and swept by powerful seasonal winds, was a genuinely dangerous body of water to cross in a small wooden vessel, and the Greeks knew this in their bones. Fact 78. Homer's great epic The Odyssey, the story of the hero Odysseus and his 10-year journey home after the Trojan War, is at its heart a sea story, and the sea in it is an enormous, living presence, breathing and shifting and obstructing and occasionally relenting. Odysseus encounters whirlpools, monsters, enchanted islands, storms sent by angry gods, and the seductive stillness of a calm that never quite lets him go home. The Odyssey was composed around the 8th century BCE and is one of the oldest works of literature in the Western tradition. It has been translated into virtually every language on earth, and people are still writing versions of it, still finding in its restless hero a shape that fits their own experience of being lost and trying and longing, impossibly, for home. We are nearly at the end of our journey now. The sea is behind us. The stars are beginning to soften at the edges as the first gray light of morning touches the horizon. We have walked through so much of this world together, through its cities and its mountains, its theaters and its temples, its battlefields and its gardens, its great minds and its ordinary afternoons. And now, in this last quiet hour before the dawn, we gather up the final threads and lay them down gently, one by one, like stones placed on a shore. Fact 79. The Greek alphabet, from which almost all European alphabets ultimately descend, was adapted from the Phoenician writing system around the 9th or 8th century BCE. The Greeks made one crucial innovation that the Phoenicians had not. They added vowels. The Phoenician system recorded only consonants, leaving the reader to supply the sounds between them from context and memory. The Greeks understood that a writing system that captured every sound of speech was more precise, more flexible, and more useful, and so they created one. The very word alphabet comes from the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. And every time we write a word in English or French or Spanish or Russian, we are using a system whose roots reach back to that Greek innovation made nearly 3,000 years ago. Fact 80. The ancient Greeks gave us a remarkable number of the words we use every day without a second thought. Democracy, philosophy, theater, mathematics, geography, biology, astronomy, history, economy, politics, tragedy, comedy, music, athlete, character, crisis, enthusiasm, paradise, magic, and hero. All of these are Greek words, carried forward into Latin, and then into English and dozens of other languages, worn smooth by centuries of use like pebbles in a riverbed. To speak any modern European language is, in part, to speak a very old, very changed version of Greek. Fact 81. The word history itself is Greek, from the word historia, meaning inquiry or learning by asking questions. It was first used in this sense by Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who lived in the 5th century BCE and wrote a vast, sprawling account of the Greco-Persian Wars that is considered the first work of history in the Western tradition. Herodotus traveled widely, asked questions of everyone he met, collected stories and customs and geographical observations, and wove them all together into a narrative that was part journalism, part travelogue, part mythology, and part careful political analysis. He was curious about everything and dismissive of almost nothing, and for that curiosity and that generosity of attention, he is called the father of history. Fact 82. The Romans, who gradually absorbed and ultimately replaced the Greek world as the dominant Mediterranean civilization from the 2nd century BCE onward, were frank and open admirers of Greek culture. The Roman poet Horace wrote that captive Greece had captured its conqueror, meaning that even as Rome conquered Greece politically and militarily, Greek art, architecture, philosophy, religion, and literature conquered Rome in return. Roman temples were built in the Greek style. Roman gods were identified with Greek gods and given their stories. Roman philosophers studied Greek thought. Roman children were educated by Greek tutors. The Roman Empire carried Greek culture to every corner of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, spreading it further than the Greeks themselves had ever managed. Fact 83. The influence of ancient Greek architecture is so pervasive in the modern world that we often stop seeing it. The columns, the pediments, the porticos, the visual vocabulary of Greek temple design is present in courthouses, museums, banks, government buildings, and universities across the Western world. When architects in the 18th and 19th centuries wanted to convey the values of democracy, justice, learning, and civic virtue, they reached instinctively for the forms the Greeks had developed. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, the British Museum in London, the Pantheon in Paris, all of them whispering, in stone, their debt to a hillside in Athens and the people who built there. Fact 84. The ancient Olympic Games were abolished in 393 CE by the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, who considered them a pagan festival incompatible with the Christian Roman Empire. They had been running every 4 years without interruption, for over 1,000 years. The site at Olympia fell into disuse, was damaged by earthquakes and floods, and was eventually buried under several meters of river silt, which preserved it remarkably well. The modern Olympic Games were revived in Athens in 1896, after a gap of 15 centuries, by a French educator named Pierre de Coubertin who believed that athletic competition between nations could promote peace and understanding. Whether it has succeeded in that hope is a question the ancient Greeks might have recognized, and might not have been entirely able to answer. Fact 85. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, is one of the most astonishing objects to survive from the ancient world. Dating to around 100 BCE, it is a hand-powered mechanical device containing dozens of precisely engineered bronze gears designed to predict astronomical positions, track the cycle of the Olympic Games, and calculate the dates of solar and lunar eclipses years in advance. It is, in effect, the world's first known analog computer, a device of breathtaking complexity and ingenuity, constructed 2,000 years before anything remotely comparable would be built again. When modern engineers have recreated it using its surviving fragments, it works.
Fact 86. Greek tragedy, though it emerged from a specific time and place, has proven to be one of the most durable and universal art forms ever created. The plays of Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides are still performed on stages all over the world, in every language, in every culture, because the questions they ask have never stopped being the right ones. What do we owe each other? What do we owe the dead? What happens when the law of the state and the law of conscience pull in opposite directions? What does it mean to suffer, and to keep going anyway? Sophocles asked these questions in an open-air theater in Athens in the 5th century BCE. We are still asking them, in our own theaters and our own lives, and the echo between then and now is one of the most quietly extraordinary things about being human. Fact 87. The philosopher Aristotle, in his work on ethics, proposed that the goal of human life was eudaimonia, a Greek word often translated as happiness, but more precisely meaning something like flourishing, or living well and doing well. Eudaimonia, Aristotle argued, was not a feeling, not a momentary pleasure or satisfaction, but a quality of a whole life, measured not in individual moments of joy, but in the overall shape of how a person lived, what they pursued, what they gave, and who they became. To ask whether you are happy, in the Aristotelian sense, is not a question you can answer on any given afternoon. It is a question only the whole of your life can answer, in retrospect. ECT. Fact 88. The ancient Greeks believed strongly in the concept of xeno, sacred hospitality. The relationship between host and guest was considered to be protected by Zeus himself, in his aspect as Zeus Xenes, guardian of strangers. Under the laws of Zeno, a host was obliged to welcome any stranger who appeared at their door, to offer food, drink, and shelter without first asking their name or their business, and to ensure their safe departure. Only after the guest had eaten and rested was it appropriate to ask who they were and where they were going. The world, the Greeks understood, is large and dangerous, and any one of us might one day be a stranger far from home, entirely dependent on the kindness of people we do not know.
Fact 89. The last great flowering of ancient Greek philosophy came in the 3rd century BCE with the Stoic school, founded in Athens by a thinker named Zeno of Citium, who taught in a painted porch called the Stoa Poikile, from which the school took its name. The Stoics taught that the path to a good life lay not in controlling external circumstances, which are largely beyond our power, but in mastering our own responses to them, our judgments, our desires, our fears. The only things truly ours, the Stoics argued, are our own thoughts and choices. Everything else, wealth, reputation, health, the opinions of others, can be taken from us at any moment, and therefore cannot be the foundation of a good life. Stoic philosophy was taken up enthusiastically by the Romans, and has experienced a remarkable revival in the modern world, read and practiced by people seeking calm and clarity in a world that often provides neither. Fact 90. And so we arrive, at last, at the end, though of course it is not really an end, because nothing about the ancient Greeks ever quite ended. Their language is in our mouths. Their buildings are in our cities. Their stories are in our theaters. Their questions are in our philosophy departments, our courtrooms, our conversations. Their medicine is in the oaths our doctors take. Their geometry is in our bridges and our buildings. Their democracy, imperfect, incomplete, and revolutionary, is in the architecture of almost every modern government on earth. The ancient Greeks lived on a small, rocky, sun-drenched peninsula in the eastern Mediterranean more than 2,000 years ago, and they are, in the most literal and traceable sense, still here. They are here in the word you are thinking with right now. They are here in the story you have just been told. The light is coming now. That first pale gold at the edge of the world, the one that comes before everything else, before the birds, before the warmth, before the day begins its long demanding business. The hills of Greece are turning from black to gray to the softest dusty rose, and the sea is catching the light and beginning to shine. And you have been here for all of it. All 100 facts. All this long, long story. You have walked through temples and theaters and mountain passes, sat in the agora and the symposium, watched the stars and thought about the shape of the earth, and listened to the sea. You don't need to hold any of it. Let it all drift down, slowly, like sediment settling through still water, finding its place in the deep quiet below. The ancient world is resting now, and so can you. Good night.